Max leaned back in his leather chair, the kind of chair that screamed, "I made it," without saying a word. His office smelled of polished wood and ambition, a far cry from the stale coffee and desperation of his old cubicle days. At 34, he'd clawed his way up from the gutter. His real estate agency was thriving, the kind of success that made people whisper his name with a mix of envy and disbelief. He'd built this life brick by brick, and damn if it didn't feel good. The door swung open, and his assistant poked her head in. "Max, you've got 2 walk-ins. They say it's urgent. Something about selling a house." "Send 'em in," he said, barely looking up from the contract he was skimming. Urgent was everyone's favorite word these days. Usually it just meant someone was late on their mortgage and panicking. Then they stepped in. Helen and Richard. Max's pen froze mid-signature, hovering over the paper like a guillotine blade that couldn't decide where to fall. Helen's blonde hair was duller than he remembered, pulled into a messy ponytail that looked like it hadn't seen a salon in months. Richard, with his broad shoulders and that smug jawline, seemed smaller somehow, less like the king of the world and more like a man who'd just lost his crown. They both carried the faint stench of desperation, the kind Max used to know all too well. "Hi, Max," Helen said, her voice softer than it had any right to be. She forced a smile, the kind you give when you're begging without wanting to admit it. "This is my husband, Richard. We came to you for help." Max blinked. Husband? Help? He almost laughed right there, a sharp, bitter sound that he swallowed back just in time. Did she really not remember? 2 years ago he'd met Richard. Oh, he'd met him all right. Not that she'd bothered to check if Max's memory still worked. Apparently it didn't matter to her then, and it sure as hell didn't now. He set the pen down slowly, folding his hands on the desk. "Helen, Richard, what a surprise." His tone was flat, curious maybe, but he kept the fireworks locked up tight. No point in giving them the satisfaction of seeing him rattled. Not yet. "We're in a bit of a bind," Richard cut in, his voice gruff, like he was still used to barking orders, even though no one was listening anymore. "Lost the business. Economy's a mess, you know how it is. We need to sell the house, fast. Heard you're the best in town." Max raised an eyebrow. The best in town. Funny how life flipped the script. He let the silence stretch, watching them squirm under the weight of it. Helen fidgeted with her purse strap, and Richard stared at the floor like it might open up and swallow him whole. Max could have helped it along, but he wasn't in the mood to play God just yet. And then, like a sucker punch, the memories hit. 2 years ago, Max had been a wreck. Depressed, broke, drowning in a sea of self-doubt. His marriage to Helen was already a sinking ship, but he'd clung to it anyway, like a fool who didn't know the difference between love and a life raft. She'd been his wife then, his anchor, or so he'd thought. Instead of pulling him up, she'd kicked him while he was down. Screaming matches turned into cold silences, and then she started disappearing. Nights out, excuses thinner than cheap wallpaper. He'd known something was wrong, but knowing and facing it are two different beasts. Then came the night she walked in with him. "Hi, honey," she'd said, casual as if she were bringing home takeout instead of a new man. "This is Richard, my new husband. He's here to help me grab my stuff." Just like that. Like Max was a piece of furniture she'd outgrown, something to leave behind on the curb. He'd been too numb to fight, too broken to even yell. While they packed her things, their things, Richard had smirked, tossing out lines like, "Real estate, huh? Tough gig for a guy like you?" And Helen had chimed in with, "Maybe if you'd tried harder we wouldn't be here." The words had landed like shards of glass, cutting deeper because they weren't wrong, at least not then. Back then, Max was a nobody, a rookie agent who couldn't sell a cardboard box to a homeless guy. And now? Now he was the one they crawled to. The irony was so thick you could choke on it. Max snapped back to the present, his eyes flicking between them. Helen looked at him like he was her last lifeline, and Richard's bravado had melted into something closer to shame. They needed him. Him. The guy they'd laughed at, the loser they'd left in the dust. "So," Max said, leaning forward just enough to make them lean in too, "you need my help selling your house. That about right?" Helen nodded too eagerly. Yes, Max, we'd really appreciate it. We're kind of out of options. He let that hang in the air, savoring it. Out of options. What a beautiful phrase. He could say no. Hell, he should say no. Let them figure it out. Let karma finish the job it started. But something else stirred in him, something colder, sharper. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about power, and Max had spent 2 years earning every ounce of it. I'll think about it. I'll see what I can do, he said finally, his voice smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. Helen exhaled, relief flooding her face. Richard muttered a gruff thanks, like it pained him to say it. They didn't know it yet, but Max wasn't doing this for them. He wasn't even sure he was doing it for himself. Maybe it was just life's way of handing him the pen to write the ending they'd never seen coming. 2 years ago, he'd been the one begging, for her to stay, for a chance, for anything. Now they were the ones on their knees. Funny how the world spins, isn't it? Max sat back, letting his eyes roam over Helen and Richard as they settled into the chairs across from him. They weren't the same people he'd last seen, not by a long shot. 2 years ago, they'd strutted into his crumbling apartment like they owned the world, Helen's heels clicking with purpose, Richard's tailored suit practically gleaming under the dim light. Back then, they'd been a power couple, the kind that made you feel small just by existing. Now they looked like the before picture in one of those late-night infomercials about financial ruin. Helen's blouse was wrinkled, the kind of careless creases that come from wearing the same thing too many days in a row. Her nails, once manicured to perfection, were chipped, and the bags under her eyes told a story her forced smile couldn't cover up. She clutched her purse like it was a shield, her fingers twitching every few seconds as if she wasn't sure where to put them. Richard, meanwhile, had the look of a man who'd lost a fight with time and gravity. His hairline had retreated further than Max remembered, speckled with gray, and his shirt strained against a gut that hadn't been there before. The swagger was gone, replaced by a slump in his shoulders and a tightness in his jaw that screamed defeat. So, Max started, keeping his voice even, professional, like he was talking to any other client. You need to sell the house. Let's get the basics. Location, size, condition. Fill me in. Helen cleared her throat, glancing at Richard like she hoped he'd take the lead. He didn't. It's, the place on Maple Drive, she said, her words careful, measured. 4 bedrooms, 3 baths. It's in decent shape mostly. Just needs a little work. Mostly, Max echoed, jotting it down on a legal pad. He didn't look up, but he could feel her shifting in her seat. What's the rush? Richard let out a grunt, crossing his arms. We're tight on cash, all right? Things haven't exactly gone our way. Max's pen paused, just for a second before he kept writing. Tight on cash, he repeated, his tone neutral as a weather report. That's one way to put it. What happened? Helen jumped in before Richard could answer, her voice a little too quick, a little too polished. The market crashed, you know. It hit everyone hard, and Richard had some unforeseen difficulties with the business. We just need to offload the house, get back on our feet. Max glanced up then, catching the way her eyes darted to the side, avoiding his. She was dodging something. He could smell it, the way you smell rain before the storm hits. Richard, on the other hand, didn't bother hiding much. He looked older than his 40-something years, his face etched with lines that hadn't been there 2 years ago. His hands resting on the arms of the chair, clenched and unclenched like he was itching to punch something or someone. The guy was a live wire, frayed and sparking, and Max could see it a mile away. Unforeseen difficulties, Max said, leaning back in his chair. He tapped the pen against his lips, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Richard, how'd you manage to steer things so far off course you ended up at the bottom? Richard's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. What's that supposed to mean? Just curious, Max said, shrugging like it was nothing. You used to have it all figured out, didn't you? Big shot, big plans. Now you're here. I'm just wondering how it all went south. The air in the room thickened, heavy with the weight of unspoken history. Helen stiffened, her lips parting as if she might jump in to smooth things over, but Richard beat her to it. He leaned forward, his voice low and jagged, like a saw cutting through metal. Look, we didn't come here for a lecture, all right? We need help, not your damn commentary. Spare me the high and mighty crap. He'd get the details later, the mortgage balance, the repairs they'd neglected, the mess they'd made of their so-called perfect life. For now, he let them stew in it. 2 years ago, they'd walked all over him, kicking him when he was down. Now they were the ones scrambling, and Max was the one holding the cards. Funny thing about life, it doesn't care who you used to be. It only cares what you've got left. And right now, Helen and Richard didn't have much. Max, though, he had everything he needed, and then some. He'd get the details later, the mortgage balance, the repairs they'd neglected, the mess they'd made of their so-called perfect life. For now, he let them stew in it. 2 years ago, they'd walked all over him, kicking him when he was down. Now they were the ones scrambling. And Max was the one holding the cards. Funny thing about life, it doesn't care who you used to be. It only cares what you've got left. And right now, Helen and Richard didn't have much. Max, though, he had everything he needed, and then some. Max didn't owe them a damn thing. That much he knew, deep in his bones, as he sat across from Helen and Richard in his office that day. But he wasn't the type to let personal baggage tank a deal, not anymore. He'd built his agency on cold, hard competence, and if there was one thing he could do, it was sell a house, even theirs. Besides, there was a twisted kind of poetry in being the one to bail them out, wasn't there? So he'd agreed, professional to the core, no trace of the resentment simmering beneath the surface. They came to me because the other agencies lowballed them, he'd told himself later, driving to their place on Maple Drive. Figures, nobody else wants to touch a sinking ship. The thought almost made him smirk, almost. When he pulled up to the house, it hit him how far they'd fallen. Now, it looked like the poster child for neglect. The paint was peeling in long, sad strips. The lawn was a patchy mess of weeds. Max stepped out of his car, clipboard in hand, and took it all in with the detached eye of a man who'd seen worse. Helen opened the door before he could knock, her smile tight and brittle. "Hey, Max, thanks for coming." Her voice was softer now, less rehearsed than in the office, but it carried that same edge of caution, like she was tiptoeing around landmines she hoped he wouldn't spot. Richard loomed behind her, arms crossed, his scowl deeper than the cracks in the driveway. "Let's just get this over with," he muttered, stepping aside to let Max in. Max nodded, all business. "Sure thing." He walked through the doorway, his shoes clicking on scuffed hardwood that hadn't seen a polish in months. The air inside smelled faintly of mildew and stale coffee, nothing like the lavender candles Helen used to burn back when they were married. He moved room to room, jotting notes on his clipboard. Outdated kitchen, chipped countertops, a water stain blooming across the ceiling in the master bedroom. Every flaw was a dollar sign ticking down, and he could already see the numbers didn't add up to what they wanted. They trailed behind him, Helen hovering like a nervous hostess, Richard stalking like a caged animal. Max kept his commentary minimal. "Needs paint here. The plumbing's outdated. Bathroom's a liability." His tone dry as a tax form. He wasn't here to gloat, not out loud anyway. But he watched them, cataloging every flinch, every sidelong glance they traded when they thought he wasn't looking. Back in the living room, he stopped, flipping through his notes. "All right," he said, turning to face them. "Here's the deal. This place, it's not moving for what you're hoping. Market's tight, and this—" he gestured vaguely at the sagging curtains and cracked baseboards. "This isn't helping. Best case, you're looking at maybe 60% of what you paid, and that's optimistic." Helen's face froze, her smile flickering like a bad light bulb. 60%? Her voice cracked on the edges, but she caught herself, smoothing it out. That's lower than we thought." Richard snorted, a sharp, bitter sound. "Lower? It's a damn insult." Max shrugged, unfazed. "That's the market. You let it sit too long. didn't keep it up. Buyers don't pay for nostalgia. They pay for what they see. Helen bit her lip, her eyes darting to Richard, then back to Max. But there's got to be a way to get more, right? You're the best, Max. That's why we came to you. Her tone was pleading now, a quiet humiliation threading through it. Yeah, Richard added, his voice rough but lacking its usual bite. You've got tricks up your sleeve, don't you? Tell us how to bump it up. It wasn't a question, it was a lifeline, and Max could hear the strain in it. He met their eyes, first Helen's, then Richard's, letting the silence stretch just long enough to sting. You want more? You've got to put money in. New paint, fix the roof, stage it properly. Bare minimum, you're looking at 10 grand to make it presentable. Maybe 15 if you wanted to actually compete. Richard's face darkened, his hands balling into fists at his sides. 10 grand? We don't have 10 grand, Max. We're drowning in debt as it is. His voice cracked, loud and raw, echoing off the bare walls. He took a step forward, then stopped himself, chest heaving like he'd just run a mile. Helen's hand flew to her mouth, a single tear slipping down her cheek. Max, please, she whispered, her composure crumbling. There's got to be something. Max stood there, clipboard tucked under his arm, his expression as unreadable as a blank check. He could have said a dozen things, could have pointed out how they'd never cared about something when they'd left him in the dust, how their new life had turned into this sad little ghost town of a house. But he didn't. He just shrugged again, a small, careless lift of his shoulders. That's how it works, he said, his voice cool and level. No cash, no shine. I can sell it as is, but don't expect miracles. Your call. Richard glared at him, jaw tight, but the fight was leaking out of him fast. Helen wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, nodding faintly like she was trying to convince herself it was fine. They were cornered, and they knew it. Max didn't need to twist the knife, they'd already done that to themselves. Max wasn't a saint, but he wasn't a fool either. When Helen and Richard handed him their sinking ship of a house, he saw the angles they couldn't, or wouldn't. So he played it smart. Step 1. List the place at the pie-in-the-sky price they'd begged for, the number they clung to like a lifeline. He knew it wouldn't sell, not in a million years, not with the cracked walls and the aura of despair clinging to it like damp rot. But he let it sit there on the market anyway, a ghost listing while the clock ticked and their panic grew. Sure enough, the calls started coming. Helen's voice, tight and brittle. Max, why hasn't anyone bitten yet? Richard's, gruff and fraying. We need the cash now, not next year. Max stayed calm, feeding them the same line every time. Market's slow, buyers are picky. Give it time. He could hear their nerves unraveling through the phone, thread by thread, and he didn't feel a shred of guilt. They'd made their bed. Let them sweat in it a little. After a couple of weeks with 0 offers, Max swooped in with his pitch. He sat them down in his office again, leaning back in that leather chair like a king on a throne. All right, he said, tapping a pen against the desk. Here's the deal. I'll buy it myself. Quick close, done in days. But it's got to be cheap. Say 65% of what you paid. Richard's face turned red, a vein popping in his forehead. 65? That's a damn joke, Max. Helen put a hand on Richard's arm, her eyes pleading. Richard, please. We can't wait forever. She turned to Max, her voice small. Can't you do a little better? We're desperate here. Max held her gaze, letting the silence do the heavy lifting. Desperate. The word hung there, raw and ugly. He could have stuck to his guns, walked away with the steel of the century. But something, maybe boredom, maybe a flicker of pity, made him relent. Fine, he said, shrugging like it didn't matter. 70%, final offer. Take it or leave it. They took it. Of course they did. They had no choice, and Max knew it. The paperwork was signed in a blur, their signatures shaky and resigned. The house was his now, a diamond in the rough tucked in a prime location they'd been too blind to leverage. He didn't waste a second. The ink was barely dry when he called up his buddy Tony, a contractor with a crew that could turn a dump into a dream in record time. Get in there, Max told him. New paint, rip out the carpet, fix the roof, make it shine. Within weeks, the place was unrecognizable. Polished floors, crisp white walls, a kitchen that didn't scream divorce special. Max wasn't rushing to sell, though. He'd rent it out, let it cash flow while the market ripened. Patience was his edge now, and he'd learned it the hard way. Sooner or later, he'd flip it for double what he'd paid. Maybe more. Not bad for a guy they'd once called a loser. While Max played chess with their old life, Helen was losing a quieter game of her own. She sat in their cramped rental apartment one evening, the TV flickering with some reality show she wasn't watching. Her mind kept drifting to Max. Max then, Max now. 2 years ago, he'd been a mess, sure, depressed, fumbling through his first real estate gig, a man she'd written off as dead weight. She'd traded him for Richard, all flash and confidence, a guy who promised the world and delivered it, until he didn't. Now, Max was steady, sharp, the kind of man who turned chaos into gold. She saw it in the way he'd handled the house, cool, calculated, unflinching. She'd misjudged him, underestimated him, and it gnawed at her like a splinter she couldn't pull out. What if she'd stayed? What if she'd seen the grit beneath the gloom, the potential she'd dismissed? She'd bet on the wrong horse, and the race was long over. Richard slumped on the couch beside her, a beer in hand, his eyes glassy and distant. He hadn't shaved in days, and the stubble made him look older, hollowed out. "We're screwed," he muttered, not for the first time that week. "Lost the business, lost the house. I'm a damn failure." His voice cracked, bitter and heavy, and he took a long swig like the bottle could swallow the truth. Helen didn't argue. She couldn't. She just stared at the TV, her mind spinning. Richard's collapse was loud, messy, a man crumbling under the weight of his own ego. Max's rise, though? That was quiet, relentless, a middle finger to everyone who doubted him. She'd picked the guy who shouted success over the one who built it, and now she was living with the wreckage. I should have known, she thought, her chest tightening. Max had it in him all along. I just didn't want to wait. Regret wasn't a loud thing. It was a slow, dull ache, a realization that settled in her gut like bad wine. She'd gambled on Flash, and Flash had burned out. Max, though, Max was still burning bright. Richard tossed the empty bottle onto the coffee table, the clink echoing in the silence. "What's the point anymore?" he said, more to himself than to her. Helen didn't answer. The deal wasn't done in one clean swoop. Money didn't flow that fast, not when you were pulling it from the wreckage of someone else's life. Max had structured the payment in chunks, a practical move that stretched the process out over a couple of weeks. It meant one more meeting with Helen and Richard, one more round of signatures to seal the deal. He didn't mind. Paperwork was just part of the game, and he'd long since mastered playing it cool. They met at his office again, a crisp Tuesday afternoon, the air outside sharp with the bite of early fall. Richard was there, slouched in his chair. His eyes were bloodshot, his shirt rumpled. Depression had settled into him like a permanent tenant. Helen sat beside him, quieter than usual, her hands folded in her lap. She'd put on a little makeup this time, a swipe of lipstick that didn't quite match the exhaustion in her eyes, like she was trying to dress up a sinking ship. Max walked them through the final papers, his voice steady and clipped. "Last installment's cleared. House is officially mine. We're done here." "Great," Richard muttered, standing abruptly. "Let's go, Helen." He didn't look at Max. Didn't need to. The defeat was written all over him. A man who'd lost more than just a house. He shuffled out, the door clicking shut behind him with a hollow thud. But Helen didn't move. She lingered, her purse still clutched in her lap, her gaze flickering to Max like she was testing the waters. He raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his chair, waiting. The silence stretched, heavy and deliberate, until she finally spoke. "Max," she started, her voice soft, cautious, like she was stepping onto thin ice. "I've been thinking a lot lately. About us. Back then. I made mistakes, you know. People change. Life changes them. He didn't say anything, just watched her, his expression unreadable. She took it as an opening, her words tumbling out a little faster. I mean, look at you now. You're not the same guy I left. Maybe there's a chance to try again, you know? Start over. Max let her words hang there, let them float in the space between them, like smoke he had no intention of breathing in. He saw it in her eyes. The hope, the quiet desperation, the flicker of a woman grasping for a lifeline she'd thrown away years ago. She was searching his face, waiting for a crack, a hint of that old softness she used to lean on. But it wasn't there. Not anymore. He tilted his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Not warm, not cruel, just done. Helen, he said, his voice low and steady. I sell houses. I don't hand out second chances. The words landed like a slap, soft but final. Her face shifted, first a flicker of shock, then a slow crumple as the realization sank in. She'd misread him, misjudged the man he'd become. The Max she'd known, the one who'd begged her to stay, who'd crumbled under her betrayal, was gone, replaced by someone sharper, stronger, someone who didn't need her anymore. Her eyes widened, then dimmed, the hope leaching out of them like air from a punctured tire. She started, but the words died in her throat. She swallowed hard, her lips pressing into a thin line. Okay, she whispered, barely audible. She stood, clutching her purse tighter, her shoulders hunching as if the room had suddenly grown too big. Take care, Max. He didn't reply, just watched as she turned and walked out, her steps slow, unsteady. The door closed behind her, a quiet click that felt louder than it should have. Helen didn't look back. She couldn't. She'd lost him for good this time, not to another man, but to the life he'd built without her. The sting of it burned in her chest, a bitter cocktail of regret and shame. She'd gambled on Richard, on flash-over substance, and now she was left with nothing but the echo of her own bad bets. Max stayed in his chair, staring at the empty doorway for a moment longer. He didn't feel anger, didn't feel the old ache of betrayal. He didn't even feel smug. What he felt was lighter, cleaner, relief, pure and simple. Helen and Richard had been shadows hanging over him for too long, ghosts of a past he'd outgrown. Now they were gone, and he was still standing. He didn't need to prove anything to them anymore. Not his worth, not his success, not a damn thing. He'd won, not by tearing them down, but by rising so far above them they couldn't touch him. The house was his, the future was his, and the past. That was just a closed file on his desk. And damn, did it feel good to be free. Max's life didn't skip a beat after Helen walked out of his office that last time. If anything, it picked up speed. His agency hummed along, deals stacking up like bricks in a wall he'd built to keep the past at bay. The house, the one he'd pried from Helen and Richard's desperate hands, was paying off already. Tony's crew had turned it into a gem, and the renters he'd lined up were forking over a steady stream of cash. Word got around, as it always does in real estate, and soon enough, a buyer came knocking. Not just any buyer, a cash-heavy investor with deep pockets and zero patience, ready to snap it up at a price that made Max's original purchase look like pocket change. He closed the deal over a glass of bourbon in his office, the paperwork signed and the profit locked in. The house had gone from a crumbling relic of someone else's failure to a goldmine in under 6 months. Max leaned back in his chair that night, the amber liquid catching the light, and let himself savor it. Not the money, though that was nice, but the proof. Proof he'd been right to play the long game, to trust his gut when everyone else was drowning in their own short-sightedness. Meanwhile, Helen and Richard's world kept unraveling, thread by ugly thread. Word trickled back to Max through the grapevine. Small towns and big failures have a way of talking. Richard had spiraled hard after the sale, cracking open bottles like they were the only thing keeping him afloat. He'd managed to scrape together enough to pay off a chunk of his debts, but it wasn't enough to climb out of the hole. The man was stuck, marinating in cheap whiskey and self-pity, barking at anyone who dared get close. Helen couldn't take it anymore, or maybe she just saw the writing on the wall. Either way, she filed for divorce, packed her bags, and left him to rot in whatever was left of their shared mess. Now she was alone, renting a one-bedroom apartment on the edge of town, the kind of place that screamed temporary but felt permanent in its quiet despair. Finding a new man wasn't as easy as she'd hoped. Turns out charm wears thin when you're lugging around that much baggage. Max heard about it one afternoon, a casual mention from a mutual acquaintance over coffee. "Helen's single again," the guy said, shrugging. "Rough year for her." Max nodded, stirring his coffee, his face giving nothing away. Later, driving home with the radio humming low, he let his mind wander back to her. Not out of longing, but curiosity. Helen was a type, wasn't she? The kind of woman who sniffed out opportunity like a shark smells blood, always chasing the next big thing, the next shiny prize. She'd latched onto Richard when he was riding high, all swagger and promises, and ditched Max when he was just a broke nobody with a flicker of potential. Trouble was, she didn't know how to stick around when the tide turned. She didn't build, she bailed. He thought about those wedding vows they'd traded years ago, back when he still believed in them. In sickness and in health, for better or for worse. Pretty words, easy to say when the champagne's flowing and the future looks like a straight line up. But Helen? She'd only signed up for the better part, the endless joyride of success. The minute worse showed up, when Max was drowning in depression, when Richard's empire started cracking, she was out the door, hunting for the next sure thing. Some women, Max mused, don't just break those vows. They never really mean them in the first place. He stepped out of the car, the cool air brushing his face, and glanced up at the stars. Life wasn't about revenge, it was about results. Helen and Richard could keep their chaos. He'd traded it for something better, a life that didn't bend for anyone. Some people chase joy and run from pain, he thought. Others learn to weather both and come out on top. Guess which one I am? If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to the channel. I wish you a great mood and good luck.